Okay, welcome back. In the second session, I'm going to pick up roughly where we left off, which of course was at the death of Tito, and talk a little bit about the next decade, the 1980s, which was a critical one for Yugoslavia. This is the moment that the great Tito project begins to unravel. It is in many ways sabotaged by precisely the kinds of people that Tito didn't want to get in power and tried to prevent from getting in power whilst he was alive. And in very short order, the country comes falling apart. Now, there's a couple of things. First of all, that when Tito died, he left the world, and he left the world stage in a very different. The world was a very different place from when he arrived as the Yugoslav leader at the end of the Second World War. In the 50s and the 60s, and perhaps even in the early 70s, Yugoslavia, the non-aligned movement, the fact that Tito had stood up to Stalin was considered to be of great importance for many in the West. The Tito existed as a rival and to a certain extent as an embarrassment to the Soviet Union. Many people in the West wanted to keep Tito afloat and to keep Tito in power, and for that reason, they flooded the country with foreign loans, money that Tito might have received, for example, from the Soviet Union. Now he wouldn't, because that revenue stream was cut off. So the West attempted, worried that if he didn't get money and if the country wasn't prosperous and wasn't wealthy, the country would perhaps capsize. So Tito received a lot of foreign aid from outside, but this began to dry up towards the end of Tito's life. And almost immediately when Tito died, many of these loans began to be called in by the IMF. By the World Bank. And as a result of this, although the country had been pretty prosperous in the 1960s and the 1970s, as elsewhere in the bloc, that prosperity evaporated in the 1980s, and the country went into a period of very sharp economic decline. Now, perhaps it wasn't as serious, or it was of comparable seriousness to places like Poland and other places, maybe not as serious as Albania or Romania. But perhaps the most important thing in the case of Yugoslavia was the contrast between the relative prosperity that the country had enjoyed when Tito was alive compared to now what was happening when Tito was out of the picture. So there was an economic problems from the very beginning. Now, there were also political problems, and they emerged very soon after Tito died as well. And they began in what we might call the unhappiest province of Yugoslavia. Now, this is a situation, unfortunately, which is a little bit complicated, so I'll try to explain it very carefully and very cautiously, but of course all of these lectures are going up online, so if there is some sort of complication, if there is something which is not clear, you can always go back and listen again. Now, if we look at slide number 1 and we look at the map, I mentioned that in Yugoslavia, the country was divided into 6 socialist republics. So Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bosnia. Now, that's relatively straightforward, I hope, and I told you that those decisions were derived from the 1943 Second Anti-Fascist Council meeting at Yaitsa. But there was an added complication. Along with these 6 socialist republics, there were 2 autonomous regions. They were both within Serbia, and they were, as you can see on this map, in the north, Vojvodina, and in the south, Kosovo. Now, those two autonomous regions also had a role on the central presidency, a seat on the central presidency. And this was greatly resented by many people within Serbia. The perspective from many Serbians' point of view, not all of them, but many of them, was that it was deeply unfair that each of the other socialist republics, Bosnia, Croatia, and so on, were masters of their own affairs entirely. In the case of Serbia, they also had to share their sovereignty, their republican sovereignty, if you like, with Vojvodina and with Kosovo. So this was deeply resented. There was a feeling amongst many Serbs that this was an attempt to undermine the power and the coherency of the Serbian Republic. Now, it's not that they were right exactly, but there was. It's not that the fears were grounded. But there was something to this. When Tito came to power and the communists came to power at the end of the Second World War, they had always feared, first and foremost, the problem of Serbia. It was the largest republic. During the Second World War, it had not given significant support, really, mass support, to the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. There had been very many people who supported the Chetniks in that country, and as a result, they really worried in the early days that if the country was undermined, the undermining would come from Serbia. That if Yugoslavia was to be prosperous, and if Yugoslavia was to be stable, and if power was to be balanced between its various parts, the situation in Serbia needed to be mitigated. The size and the strength of a potential Serbian republic needed to be diluted in a little way, and this was the sort of the solution that they had. So there were reasons for doing this, and they looked at the interwar period, and they saw the many problems that supposed Serbian hegemony had caused in the interwar period, and this was kind of the solution that they had. Now, the province of Kosovo, as I said, was a particularly unhappy one. Kosovo was part of Serbia. It was an intrinsic part of the Serbian Republic. But nevertheless, it had a very different history. It had long been part of the Ottoman Empire. And as a result, this particular part of Serbia had been colonized by Albanians, mainly, of course, once upon a time of the Muslim faith, but not exclusively. So over the years, the ethnic distribution of Kosovo had become predominantly Albanian. And you can see, if we look at slide number 3, that's an image of the ethnic composition of Kosovo according to the census, the last Yugoslav census of 1981. And you can see that the large majority of people living there, about 80%, I think between 80-85% at the time, were ethnic Albanian. Now, the remaining portion of the people living there were ethnic Serbs, and you can see these pink patches is where the Serbs were based in Kosovo. Now, the demographic balance within Kosovo was altering as the years went by. And there were various reasons for this. One of the reasons was that Kosovo was by far the poorest, the most impoverished part of Yugoslavia. It had been lagging in terms of modernization, in terms of industrialization, in terms of many different metrics. It had been lagging behind the rest of the country, much, much poorer than, for example, the richer republics like Slovenia and Croatia. So this was one problem. And many people who lived there, many Serbs, for example, were simply leaving because there were not employment prospects. There were a few education prospects. So there was a kind of an exodus of Serbs who would go to other parts of the country, most frequently Belgrade, but also Zagreb and Ljubljana, and they would find work and employment in those parts of the country. So this was one thing. Now the other thing was there was an extraordinarily high birth rate amongst the Albanian population. They were the youngest nation, the youngest people in Europe in the 1980s, and they were having the largest number, Albanian families were having the largest number of children. I don't know the exact figures, but it was extremely high. So there was this as well, and this was affecting the ethnic makeup of the country, and this was creating a larger ethnic Albanian majority at the expense of the Serbian. So this was the other matter. Now this was a cause of alarm for many Serbs that they saw what was happening in Kosovo, and they were deeply concerned about the transformations that were taking place. Now, again, it's very complicated. The sort of the issue with Kosovo and the Serbs in Kosovo was kind of a paradoxical one. This territory was always thought of as being intrinsically part of Serbia. It was considered by many Serbs to be a Serbian territory, not an independent one. So the fact that Tito had bequeathed upon it independent, autonomous status was resented by many people in Albania. In Kosovo. This was one thing. The other thing was that from the 1960s onwards, so that period of reforms which I mentioned in the previous session, in the previous lecture, the Serbs there felt like second-class citizens. They believed, rightly or wrongly, that party positions, university positions, the police, the civil service, the bureaucracy, was dominated by ethnic Albanians, and Serbs were being squeezed out. They were being treated as second-class citizens. They were being denied their ethnic rights. Now, I say this is paradoxical because if you're following me outright, and we'll look at the map in a minute, but if we look at the ethnic map, the ethnic makeup of Yugoslavia writ large, the Serbs are the majority people in this country, and there are Serbs in Croatia, there are Serbs in Bosnia, and of course there are Serbs throughout Kosovo. But in Kosovo itself, which has an autonomous and semi-separated status from Serbia, there was a feeling among Serbs that they were the minority, that those were people who were being persecuted, that those were people who were suffering, that those were people who were being treated unfairly. So in a sense, it's almost, and then this is a very rough parallel, but it's a little bit like in Northern Ireland, where you have a Protestant group who identify with their kin state, Great Britain, and identify as British, and in this sense are part of the majority group within Great Britain, but at the same time feel themselves to be an isolated frontier community in a different part of the country, separated from the mainland, and acting as if their rights and their position is being denied. So that's kind of the paradox of the Kosovar Serbs. Now, in the middle of the 1980s, a real bombshell is dropped. An evening newspaper in Belgrade, Večernje Novosti, so the evening news, publishes parts of a leaked memorandum that is being prepared by the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's known as SANU, and SANU would be the acronym of the Serbian initials in Serbia. Now, this was a document which had been commissioned by the Serbian Academy, was being worked on by a group of intellectuals, and was discussing the position of the Serbs within Yugoslavia. Now, it wasn't meant for public consumption, but nevertheless, it was very artfully leaked to the public in the middle of the 1980s, in 1986. Now, we do have the document. I don't know if you're able to get to it, but we do have a fuller version of the document in English as part of a documentary collection in our library. But unfortunately, of course, many of you will not be able to get access to that. So, I understand if you wanted to use that as a source, it might be quite a difficult one to get to, which is a bit of a shame. But the gist of it was that throughout Yugoslavia, the Serbs were being treated badly. They were being persecuted. They were being victimized. They were being denied their individual rights, their human rights, and they were really suffering within Yugoslavia. Now, these ideas were based upon notions about the division of the Serbian Republic. A notion that many Serbian nationalists had, that Tito didn't like the Serbs, that Tito was treating them unfairly. It was a grab bag of many different sort of ideas and many different notions. Now, you can see a quotation, one part of a citation of the document that's in slide number 4. And it goes, it reads the following, and it says, and this is from the Sarnu document, part of the leaked document. Except during the period of the NDH, so that's the independent state of Croatia, the fascist state, the Ustasha state, Serbs in Croatia have never been as endangered as they are today. The resolution of their national status must be a top priority political question. If a solution is not found, the consequences will be damaging on many levels. Now, it's sort of, and then the document went on like this, and it used terms like genocide, and it used very heated language. Now, a couple of things about this. First of all, in the 21st century, living in Ireland or living in Western Europe, the notion that official documents and communiques get leaked is not a huge deal. I mean, when it happens, when the latest contingency plans for Brexit, for example, get leaked, there is a fallout and there is scandal, but it's not, it does happen, right? And it does happen quite a lot, depending on which government is in power and what they're doing. It virtually never happened in Yugoslavia. This is not a liberal state. This is not an open political society. Information is very tightly controlled, despite the relaxations that Tito has introduced since the communists came to power. And on top of that, it's almost like a taboo that you don't speak about certain things. You don't speak about the NDH. You don't speak too much about the Ustasha. You don't speak about the relations and how difficult they are between the various nationalities. You attempt to keep a lid on these matters, on these things. So a leak like this in an illiberal and not open society, where the media is not fully open, where political life is dominated by one party, controlled by one party. This was a huge deal. This was a major bombshell, and it really rocked the country. The language that was used, all of this kind of thing. Now, the second reason that this was an extremely worrying development for many people in Yugoslavia had to do with the map. And if we turn to slide number 5, I've put up what I'm afraid to say is a very crude ethnic map of Yugoslavia at the time, but it does give a very rough idea about the ethnic distribution of various groups. Now you can see there's the map, and you can see that there are various nationalities living in various parts of the country. Croats, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Bosnian Muslims in green. But you can also see that the Serbs, who are coloured in purple on this map, are spread out across the entire country. Of course, they are an outright majority in Serbia itself, but you also have Serbian minorities in Bosnia, very sizable ones. You also have a Serbian community living in Croatia as well. And of course, as we've already mentioned, a minority living in Kosovo. Now, in case you're interested, there are various reasons for this, and one of the reasons is that way back in the early modern period, when this was the front line, the Balkans was the front line between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. At various times during various wars, particularly at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, there had been sort of flights of Christian refugees trying to escape the advancing Ottoman Empire, fearing reprisals, and being settled by the Habsburgs in their territories. So in places like what is today Croatia, and what is today Bosnia. This is why one of the reasons why the Serbian communities are spread out so much. They're sort of they're the descendants of these kind of refugee columns. So the problem was that it was not only that Serbia was the largest national group within Yugoslavia, it was also the most dispersed. So that if this was to rise as one group, if there was to be a sort of collective response from the leadership or from from Serbian society, from Serbian people, recognizing a community of suffering, a common community of fate, in this document that had been published, it could really jeopardize not just the balance of each republic, but I mean within each republic as well. I mean, if the Serbian minority in Croatia rejected Croatian Republican rule, or in Bosnia rejected Bosnian Republican rule, it could become a very grievous problem. It could become a very serious matter. Now, the response of the Yugoslav Communist Party was the following one. Coming back to Kosovo, and in light of the memorandum that was published in 1986, the Yugoslav Communist Party could see that this was a very delicate matter, and it needed to be addressed, and it needed to be handled in a very sensitive fashion. Now, their response was to send down a rising star of the Serbian party down from Belgrade to visit Kosovo, and essentially to take part in a photo op, in a publicity stunt. He would go to Kosovo, this high-ranking functionary. He would listen to the Albanian population. He would listen to the Serbian population. All of this would be filmed. It would be beamed across the evening news. And essentially, this would be a way of the Communist Party saying, we're taking this seriously. We're listening to all sides. We want people to live together in this common socialist state. And we're not neglecting you. We see that you have many problems. We see that there are tensions here, but we want to listen to all sides. Now, the man they sent is in slide number 6. It is a man called Slobodan Milosevic. Now, Milosevic maybe is a name that might be meaningful to some of you, although it's completely fine if it isn't. But it might be. I mean, he would have been a household name in the 1990s, but now no longer. Slobodan Milosevic was considered to be a very safe pair of hands. He was a person who had been part of the had been part of the Serbian Communist Party. He had risen up through the ranks. He had spent some time in America, in Chicago. He worked at a bank there. So he spoke pretty good English with an American accent. But first and foremost, he seemed to be, he gave every impression of being an extremely reliable and dedicated communist functionary, somebody who was not tainted by this rising problem of Serbian nationalism. Although Milosevic indeed was a Serb. Now, in slide number A7, you can see the two most important political relationships that Slobodan Milosevic had. The first was with his wife, a woman who was also a politician named Mira Markovic, who he had married at a very young age. I think they had met either at college or maybe even at high school. And the two people were inseparable. Politically, their ideas were very in sync. But also sort of intimately and personally, the two of them were always together. Now, I never met Milosevic, and I never met Mira, but both of them are dead now. But my colleagues have done at various times. One person is a research analyst in the War Crimes Tribunal, which is where Milosevic ended up. And they said that whenever they met them, and foreign journalists would also comment on this as well, the two of them had this almost kind of, they would speak to each other in baby speak, that they would just be sort of, they were inseparable. He would barely speak without Mira saying something, or Mira would not speak without consulting Slobo, first of all. So that's one thing. Now, the other important relationship in his life was his political mentor, a man called Ivan Stambolic, and you can see him there in slide number 7. Now, it was Stambolic who had cultivated Slobodan Milosevic, who had ushered his rank, ushered his sort of rise up the ranks of the Communist Party, had looked out for him, and it was essentially his decision that Milosevic would go down to Kosovo to sort of resolve this problem. Now, if we jump forward a little bit, we will see just how sort of serpentine and how treacherous politically Milosevic was. Not only did he double-cross Stambolic, breaking the political promises and the political vows and the political trust that Stambolic had put in him, but ultimately, much further down the line, it seems that Milosevic actually had Stambolic killed. He disappeared whilst out jogging in the late 1990s, and his body was recovered several years later in a ditch in Belgrade, been buried in a ditch. That's almost certainly the work of Milosevic, the work of people around him. So an incredibly ruthless, an incredibly callous political operator. Now, all of that is in the future. If we jump back to the 1980s, Milosevic arrived in Kosovo in 1987 to take part in this staged, managed meeting between the two groups. Now, what happens is an incredible transformation. It's as if Milosevic, in real time, suddenly realizes that Serbian nationalism is a potent means of him advancing his own political career and his own political direction. Milosevic sits in on this town hall meeting and listens to the local Communist Party functionaries, most of whom, of course, were Albanian, ethnic Albanian. But whilst he's doing this, there is a protest movement of mainly Kosovar Serbs gathering outside this town hall meeting down in Kosovo. And Milosevic breaks with script, goes out of the town hall meeting, and meets with these Kosovar Serbs and begins to talk to them. And you can almost see, again, all of this, remember, is filmed on the night on the 6 o'clock news, or it's broadcast later on the 6 o'clock news. You can almost see in these discussions, they took place over 2 days, these impromptu discussions that Milosevic is having, that he realizes the potency of this issue, of this Serbian nationalist cause, that he realizes that these are a group of people who are looking for a champion, who don't find one within the Communist Party as it stands, certainly don't find one in Kosovo, but this is a role that maybe Milosevic could fulfill. So contrary to what he's promised Stambolic, contrary to the brief that he's been given, the tasks that he's been assigned to carry out down in Kosovo, it looks as if Milosevic is sort of veering away from the track and has decided instead to become the champion of the Kosovar Serbs and of the various nationalist grievances. Now, there's a very good BBC documentary that was made in the mid-1990s and can be found online, I think on YouTube. It's called The Death of Yugoslavia. And the first episode of The Death of Yugoslavia, which lasts about 50 minutes, outlines pretty much everything that many of the things that I'm saying vis-a-vis Kosovo in the 1980s and the rise of Slobodan Milosevic and the rise of nationalism. There are 6 episodes in total. They move on to different parts of the story, to Croatia and to Bosnia and all this kind of thing. But the first episode is very good on the rise of Milosevic. And it also interviews Milosevic. I mean, Milosevic was quite unguarded, and so was Mira, actually, speaking at the time to these journalists, hoping, of course, to get their own side of the story across. Now, very famously, and you can see this in the BBC documentary, there is an electrifying moment as Milosevic is talking to these Kosovar Serbs outside the town hall meeting. They're being pushed back by the police. And one of the protesters calls out to Milosevic, Slobo, that's what they called him. It's like a diminutive of his first name. Slobo, they're beating us. They're beating us, the police. To which Slobodan Milosevic immediately responds, "Nobody has the right to beat you. Nobody should dare to beat you." And this one phrase, "nobody should dare to beat you," became the clarion call, the slogan of what would now become the Serbian nationalist renaissance, the revival, the political revival of Serbs throughout Yugoslavia, which would be spearheaded, which would be led by Slobodan Milosevic, and of course also firmly in tow Mira Markovic. It's essentially what happens then is that Milosevic, in a sense, harnesses all of these grievances that have been set out in the Sanu memorandum. The notional genocide of the Serbs, the suffering that they're facing in Croatia and in Bosnia and in Kosovo, the supposedly unfair treatment to which they're being subjected under the 1974 Constitution. Not only does Milosevic not tame these ideas, he actually actively inflames them. And the reason he does this is because he can see this is an extremely potent political force, and that he spearheads it, he can become one of the most powerful figures, if not the most powerful figure within Yugoslavia. Now, if we turn to slide number 9, you will see the transformation of Slobodan Milosevic. This is him returning to Kosovo in 1989 and giving a speech, which I put on YouTube, in front of what is approximated to be a million Serbs, bussed in from Belgrade, bussed in from Herzegovina, bussed in from Croatia, all arriving to listen to their new champion, Slobodan Milosevic, speak on their behalf. And the language, there are subtitles in this YouTube clip as well. The language that he has used is completely transformed from the kind of bureaucratic talk that you would have heard in Tito's time, and even in the early 80s. He's talking about history, he's talking about national identity, he's talking in very kind of romantic nationalist or ethno-nationalist terms, and this is really the direction that he's taking Yugoslavia. Now, from 1987 until 1989, Milosevic embarks on a whirlwind political transformation of Yugoslavia. Again, it's relatively complicated, but if you remember when I told you how the post-Tito political setup involved a rotating presidency, 6 republics, 2 autonomous regions. Is it complicated enough for you yet? Those, of course, were Vojvodina and Kosovo. Each of these had a vote on the central presidency, 8 votes in total. What Milosevic did was he started to transform the makeup of the higher echelons of parties in places like Montenegro, in Kosovo, and up north in Vojvodina, as well as, of course, Serbia, which he was already, now that he'd deposed of Stambolic, he was the absolute master there too. He always claimed that this was an anti-bureaucratic revolution, that he was attempting to oust the old ways, that he was something like a Balkan Gorbachev, who was carrying out perestroika within Yugoslavia. But the reality was that Milosevic, in these meetings and these rallies that he was holding, was seizing power of the various political components and constitutional components of Yugoslavia. So from 1987 until 1989, as I say, he embarks on a whirlwind throughout Yugoslavia, installing his people in Kosovo. He's there in Serbia. He takes Vojvodina. He takes Montenegro. This gives him 4 votes on the 8-vote presidency. It means he now has a controlling stake. Now, this is deeply resented, and it is particularly resented by Slovenia and Croatia in particular. I'll very briefly mention Slovenia because it's on my mind quite a lot at the moment, just in passing, because it's quite interesting. In the 1980s, so first of all, Slovenia and Croatia were the richest of the provinces, the richest of the parts of Yugoslavia, had the most wealth, and Croatia got a lot of money from tourism. Very different from Kosovo, much more wealthy, much better off. I'm running out of batteries, but I think this is going to hold. I hope this is going to hold. So what I'm saying. They resented these changes, and they really despised Milosevic. They felt that he was dragging them down. The whole of Europe was transforming. The communism was ending everywhere, and at the same time, you had this kind of neo-Stalinist. Stalinist nationalist in Serbia, who was who was kind of taking up the heat. Now, there was a very famous trial of dissidents, dissident journalists in Slovenia in 1988. A group of journalists who were writing for the communist youth magazine Mladina, which had become essentially an opposition magazine. And they had been publishing critical articles of the JNA, of the Yugoslav People's Army. And a group of them, the so-called Mladina 4, were put on trial in what was essentially a kangaroo court, and were sentenced to prison terms for insulting and sharing military secrets. And it was a moment which really kind of brought the whole of Slovene civic and political culture together. The sense that these men who were being put on trial were being subjected to a very humiliating and ridiculous trial. Now, one of the people who was put on trial that day is a man called Janez Janša. And Janez Janša, I mention him because he is the current prime minister of Slovenia, and his political trajectory in the intervening 3 decades has been quite a remarkable one. He was once upon a time in the 80s a member of the Communist Party. He became a dissident in the 1980s. He's been in and out of office since then. He's been prime minister 3 times. This is his 3rd time. And he's changed really into really a kind of a right-wing populist, somebody who is regularly up on Twitter congratulating Trump on his election victory, and has really transformed into something very different from what he began. And I mention him specifically because he and I have had a few exchanges in the last few days, and recently a group of colleagues and I, about 150 colleagues, published a petition directed towards him, protesting his what we feel to be his assault on academic freedom. Have some colleagues in Slovenia who are losing their jobs, and we believe this to be politically motivated. And I think we have quite strong evidence for that. Janša, unfortunately, is not one. He's one who will certainly get involved in the fight. And so in the last few days, he and an army of right-wing trolls have been unleashed on Twitter. And if you want to sort of see the behavior of these people, I invite you to go and look at my Twitter feed, which is as we speak being assailed by various Janša supporting gremlins who were very unhappy about a Western academic getting involved in Slovene business. Okay, back to the history. So it comes to a head, and in 1990, January 1990. At the 14th Extraordinary Congress of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, the Slovenes and the Croats go to Belgrade. It was held in the Sava Center, which is a convention center in Belgrade. And they decide to confront Milosevic and attempt to alter the constitution once again so that he cannot monopolize power in the way that he has been doing. Now, it's a fool's errand. There's no chance of reversing what has happened. And the reason there is no chance is that Milosevic has, as I said earlier, a controlling majority on the presidency. Every time the Slovene party attempted to make what many consider to be very reasonable alterations to the constitution, Milosevic and his people held up. They voted it down. They held up their cards, and you can see him doing this in slide number 12. He's holding up a card which says protiv, which means against. So turning down the motion. And they just kept doing this, and it became almost like a circus. Every time they held one up, everyone cheered. And this was pretty much the end of the story. Now, what happened, and again, you can see this in the first or maybe the second episode of The Death of Yugoslavia, is unbelievably dramatic. The Slovenes decide that there is no point in staying within the Yugoslav Federation, given the shenanigans of Slobodan Milosevic. They have it out with Milosevic, and at that very moment they walk away from the forum. They pack their bags and they leave, and they head back to Ljubljana. They are followed by the Croat delegation, who are also extremely concerned with the direction that things are going in. Now, what this means is a very strange situation. It means essentially that in Croatia and in Slovenia, that they go back to their republics in 1990, and they organize multi-party elections, and in those elections, non-communist parties are voted in. Now, this is a very strange set of circumstances, and it's strange because we now have a country which is partially ruled by the communists and partially not ruled, i.e. Croatia and Slovenia have non-communist governments, up there in their republics, and the rest of the country, at least for the time being, is ruled by the Yugoslav Communist Party. So this is a very, I mean, there's nothing like it. You can't, either the Communist Party has mono-party control or it doesn't. But I mean, this kind of strange halfway house is a very weird one. So that happened. Ultimately, Slovenia and Croatia hold referendums on independence from the Yugoslav Federation, which are passed unanimously, and both republics declare their independence in the summer, coordinate declarations of independence in the summer of 1991, in June 1991. So Yugoslavia is shrinking. Slovenia and Croatia have announced their independence from the bloc. It's been recognized by the European Economic Community, soon to be the UN, the EU, the European Union, and that is essentially the end, by the looks of it, of Yugoslavia. Now, it's this act of breaking away that begins the wars of Yugoslav secession. The first conflict takes place in Slovenia. It lasts 10 days, and it is essentially an attempt by the Yugoslav People's Army, by the JNA, to secure the western border, to secure Slovenia's outer border, and bring Slovenia back into the Yugoslav Federation. It was one of their war plans. They had various. One was against the Soviets. One was, I guess, against a NATO invasion from Austria. One was, of course, an act of separation from Yugoslavia. Now, it lasted about 10 days, around 60 casualties, mainly fighters of the Yugoslav People's Army, so the JNA. But it ends relatively quickly. Milosevic basically, in confusion, Milosevic essentially recalls the JNA, asks them to leave Slovenia and move into barracks in Croatia. Now, the reason he does this can be discerned on slide number 15. Back to this very crude but nevertheless workable map of the ethnic groups within Yugoslavia. Milosevic has seen now that his plan A is not going to be effective. It's not going to be operational. His plan A was that he would become the new de facto leader, if you like, the new Tito, within Yugoslavia, that he would have the majority of the power, in a sense absolute power, and he would rule Yugoslavia as a whole. That was his plan A. With the secession of Slovenia, and particularly with the acknowledgement of the EEC, of the European Economic Community, so therefore the international community of these acts of secession, Milosevic now moved to Plan B. And his Plan B was the following thing. Accepting now that Yugoslavia, as Tito had built it, could not be saved, that it was over, that Slovenia was gone, that it looked like Croatia was gone as well, he now moved to Plan B, which was to secure a territory which incorporated all of the Serbs who had been living within Yugoslavia, to create, if you like, a greater Serbian state whose borders would expand outward into Bosnia, outward into Croatia, and that this would be the solution to the Serbian question. This would be the solution, to the nationalist question that Milosevic had essentially raised and was trying to answer ever since that visit to Kosovo in 1986. Now, the problem, of course, there were various problems. One of the problems was that in occupying these territories, Milosevic's army, the JNA, which would very quickly become sort of a secessionist army, a nationalist army, was occupying sovereign territory of independent states, Croatia, from 1992 onwards, Bosnia. So it was doing this illegally. It claimed it was there as a peacekeeping force, but nobody was particularly fooled. It was clear what was really happening here. The second thing is that it was impossible to demarcate ethnically clean, ethnically pure territories without conducting. You can see from this map that it's not a simple matter. It's not like, as I said earlier, all the Serbs are conglomerated in one part. That they're all. They're all based in a single territory. They're spread throughout the country, and there are pockets of non-Serbs throughout the country in places like Bosnia and throughout these territories that Milosevic claimed. What that meant in practice was Milosevic would have to undertake to remove non-Serbians from the territories that he was occupying. And this meant ethnically cleansing them, forcibly removing them, or in extreme cases, killing them. Now, I'm not really going to go into the wars themselves, but I recommend that if anyone is interested in looking further at this topic, they can look at the documentary, The Death of Yugoslavia. It explains everything in very clear terms and outlines everything that happened. In this country, and this is a very good and a very helpful way in. But the most violence occurred in Bosnia, and of course the reason for this intense violence there was that there were the ethnic mix of this country, impossible to draw borders anywhere, a very large Bosnian Muslim presence, Serbs distributed throughout various parts of the country. It was going to be a huge mess, but Milosevic was attempting to solve this through ethnic cleansing, through in some cases genocide against the Bosnian Muslim population within Bosnia. Okay, that's how it happened. That's how Yugoslavia broke up. The wars went on throughout the 1990s, ending in Kosovo, ultimately in 1998, 1999. I would say that the chances of these territories going back to war are relatively small, but never say never. But there are indeed still very many problems unresolved from the war years. One of the most acute problems is that the personalities and the people who were involved in this period of Yugoslav politics, people like Janša, for example, are still very much on the scene, and their careers are still very much tied to the violence of the 1990s. Okay, thank you.